pottery class full of art students decided to try a little experiment to find out what really gives people the opportunity to innovate and excel at their craft. They divided their class up into 2 groups and gave them each different goals. The first group was told that they would have to be graded on 1 pot by the end of the semester. That 1 pot, after studying all the forms and styles and textures of pottery, that 1 pot would decide their grade. The other group would be graded on how many pots they could produce by the end of the semester. It didn't matter how good they were, they just had to make as many as they could, demonstrating the styles and textures that they were learning about. So, at the end of the semester, which group do you think actually ended up with the most well-crafted pottery? This story is taken from the book Art and Fear by David Bayless and Ted Orland, and a short book that I'm showing here. I'd highly recommend it, because anyone in a field that has creativity under pressure can relate to what they're saying. They note many of the obstacles that get in the way of our goals and cover a lot more ground than what I'm touching on right now. And here's their observations from the book. Come grading time, a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded for quantity. Because it seemed that while the quantity group was churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection and in the end had little more to show for it than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. And I think this makes intuitive sense to us, because we've all seen people spin their wheels as they're stuck in the snow. I'm talking faster than I realized. We know they're never going to execute their plans they're coming up with. It's like they take their ideas too seriously. And sometimes those people are us. So what makes us spin our wheels on these ideas without following through and end up with those theories in a pile of dead clay? Fear. Short-circuiting ourselves before we even get started. We're too afraid to fail and think that our first time has to be perfection. But who said the rough draft had to be the final copy? Now granted, we don't get the luxury of a teacher telling us to prototype to your heart's content for a grade. But that shouldn't matter. This kind of personal prototyping, where we build and then throw out and throw out, should happen all the time. After all, we used to do it all the time. My son Ian is just over a year old. He has a very, very poor sense of balance. He trips over his own feet, lands face first in the mud, and stands back up with the proudest smile on his face. He has his own private lingo that none of us understand. He earnestly tries to get our attention and say stuff that I'm sure he thinks is deep. If he really knew what was going on, he'd realize we weren't laughing with him. And if he were any older, we'd call him a babbling idiot. But he doesn't care. He doesn't know any better. Most of the time, he's just having a blast. He's learning about his limbs, his ears, his eyes, his tongue. He's learning about perspective and distance. He figured out how close to the electrical sockets he can get before mommy and daddy freak out. No. He thinks that's hilarious, by the way. So how far do you think he'd get in life if he stopped right now at barely over a year of age and grew self-conscious? Yeah, I fell down on my soiled diaper butt the last 3 times I tried to run. I'm going to stay inside. Now, there is a time for critical reflection, but not when you play. You can Google and find archives of prominent tech blogs just absolutely lambasting Twitter as the dumbest idea on the planet. Now, profitability models aside, they didn't get it. Why would you want to read about somebody's lunch? That's all they could see. Gmail was completely rewritten 3 times before it even went public. And it was invented by a guy in his spare time thinking, oh, this would be really cool if we could pull this thing off. I argue that this is play. Not when we just theorize in our heads. No, it's when we commit to something, like on paper. Like a rough draft, rolling up our sleeves, sticking our hands into whatever materials we have before us, toying with possibilities. It's the grown-up version of stumbling around. As a personal example of this, I taught myself the Ruby programming language about a year and a half ago, a little over a year and a half ago, by writing web applications that I thought would be fun and useful to use. I wrote myself an invoicer, a time tracker, a social network grocery shopping application with my wife. Way too ambitious for me. I was hoping that each of these ideas could turn into something, like a product or whatever. Maybe make some money on the side. But none of them went anywhere. But that's okay. I needed to do it. I needed to do this. I needed to play to learn Ruby. And little did I know, I'd stubbed my toe on an opportunity to compete in an international competition with Andrew, Joe, and Josh here. First place winners, by the way. And I stubbed my toe on my job within 3. This hands-in-the-dirt kind of prototyping and experimentation is the way we're wired. Our lives are crazy busy, and doing stuff like this may feel unfocused and seem like a waste, but I argue that it is natural and necessary to our productivity. Remember to take times to cultivate a little bit of this reckless, playful attitude, and don't forget to play.